Before the establishment of the Roman Republic, areas in present-day Italy and surrounding lands were divided up into lots of little kingdoms with many different rulers. Some kings were richer and more powerful than others. The kings and their people fought each other all the time, and over the years they developed long-standing rivalries that often resulted in warfare. The city of Rome was controlled by a long line of Etruscan kings who had ruled for several generations. Etruscan kings worried above all else about losing power, especially losing control of their city. They figured the best way to hang on to power was to be as harsh as possible with their subjects, the people over whom they ruled. Around 500 BC, the people living in Rome decided they had had enough. They overthrew their Etruscan king and created a new form of government. Rome's new form of government was now called a republic. In some very important ways, this new government was based on a form of government that the ancient Greeks practiced at the time, democracy. Instead of having a king make all the laws and tell everyone else what to do, the Romans decided that the citizens, the people, should be able to elect those who would work together to make decisions and form laws, to guide how their society was ruled. In this new form of government, the people had more of a voice in how their society would be ruled as a republic. Here's how the new government worked. Instead of a king, there was a group of people called the Senate. Members of the Senate were called senators. There were 300 senators in the Roman Senate, all of whom were men. Senators held their position for as long as they lived. The people elected 2 consuls, 2 people whose job it was to make final decisions on whether a new law should be passed or whether, for instance, to go to war. They had the power to command the army and were advised by the Senate. The consuls were powerful people in the Roman Republic, but they did not have the power to write new laws on their own. Senators debated over what kinds of laws were needed in Rome. When senators came to an agreement, they would advise the consuls on their decisions. If one consul made a decision that the other consul did not approve of, he could say veto, which is Latin for I forbid. Even though the consuls had the attributes of being very important and powerful, the 2 consuls had to work together to create a process of checks and balances, or a way to balance out each other's decision. These ideas of veto and checks and balances are 2 practices from ancient Rome that are part of the American government and other governments around the world today. Not all citizens of Rome were treated equally. In fact, some people living in Rome were not citizens at all. People of Rome were divided into groups, each with different rights and privileges under the law. The smallest and most powerful group was called the patricians. Patricians were Rome's elite, a small group of wealthy, powerful people who owned large homes in the city, vineyards in the country, and villas on the coast. The patricians were citizens of Rome, meaning they had the right to vote, and they had certain protections and privileges under the law. Because they were the most educated and privileged group, the patricians were also the ones most likely to become senators, so they got to make a lot of the laws in the Roman Republic. As you might guess, the people in the painting are wealthy Roman patricians. In contrast to the ancient Greek culture, women in ancient Rome were considered citizens, and wealthy women were part of the elite patrician group, although they could not vote or serve as a senator or a consul. Another group of Roman citizens were called plebeians. Plebeians were second-class citizens, meaning that they did not have all the rights and privileges enjoyed by the patricians. However, the plebeians had one big advantage: numbers. Because the plebeians made up the largest portion of Roman citizenry by far, the wealthy patricians learned that they needed to make sure the plebeians were happy, or at least happy enough that they wouldn't rise up and try to take more power for themselves. Like patricians, plebeians were citizens so they could vote. However, they were subject to a different set of laws than the patricians. For instance, a patrician could freely insult and even attack a plebeian, but a plebeian would be in big trouble if he did the same to a patrician. Plebeians could own property, but it was hard for them to gain enough land or money to become as rich or as powerful as the patricians. Plebeians came in all shapes and sizes, including fairly wealthy shopkeepers and traders, hard-working farmers and fishermen, and other poor and lowly workers. Farmers were important because plentiful crops were very necessary for the success of Rome's culture and civilization. That is one of the main reasons why Romans worshipped Saturn, the god of the harvest. When farmers are successful and have a great harvest, they have more food than they really need to just feed their family. This is called a surplus. Roman farmers with a surplus of food could share their bountiful supply or sell it to other people at the marketplace. Those people, in turn, didn't have to work as hard to feed themselves. Instead, they could turn their attention to other things like making pottery, blacksmithing, or weaving cloth. Some Romans worked on making elaborate sculptures and mosaics. When they had a surplus of harvested crops, ancient Romans also had a surplus of time to honor their gods, which they spent by building temples, going to festivals like Saturnalia, and participating in rituals. Many Romans who didn't farm were traders and merchants. They would sell goods that came from ships from all over the known world. Remember, Italy is a peninsula in the Mediterranean Sea. These goods would be sold in markets, located in large open gathering places called forums. In these forums, people could shop, listen to debates, and worship in temples. The biggest forum was in the heart of Rome and was therefore called the Roman Forum, or just the Forum. The Senate had an important building in the Forum where the senators and consuls met to debate and discuss issues. The Forum was a very important place in Roman society, serving as a gathering place of culture, economy, politics, religion, and much more. The ruins of the Forum today attract many tourists each year. Another group of people who lived in Rome were the slaves. Slaves were not considered citizens of Rome, so they could not vote. Slaves belonged to their owners, so they did not have the freedom to do as they pleased. Slaves could not choose where to work or where to live. They had no choice in what job they got to do. They were not allowed to quit the jobs the owners gave them. Roman slaves did have some rights. For instance, Roman slaves were allowed to receive as much education as they needed to be better at whatever job they had. After some time, if slaves worked very hard for their owner, they could earn their freedom. Once slaves were given their freedom, their children were considered full Roman citizens. You may be wondering where these slaves came from. As Rome expanded into new territories, the Romans fought wars with the people already living in those areas. It was common for the people on the losing side of the war to become slaves for the winning side when the war was over. Slaves were considered the property of their owners. They had to obey their owners and do difficult work for no pay. They were not allowed to insult or attack a Roman citizen, or there would be consequences. Slaves were considered the most lowly people in Roman society, at the other end of the spectrum from the elite class. Whether patrician, plebeian, or slave, man, woman, or child, all of the people of ancient Rome contributed in their own ways to the many components of this ancient civilization.